Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming today. My name is Linda Pentz Gunter. I'm the Executive Director of Beyond Nuclear, one of the two hosting organizations today of this briefing, along with Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We are here today with this powerful lineup of experts to bring their much-needed voices and insights to Capitol Hill. At the Senate and House hearings on nuclear power, you have heard from industry and their corporate, profit-driven aspirations. None of this is in the public interest. Today, we have experts in the fields of energy and security policy, science, regulation, and law who will present a very different picture. Because, despite Citizens United, corporations are not people, and fast-tracking or circumventing nuclear power plant safety oversight to cut costs for industry, handing safety regulation off to a nuclear promoter, presenting a false nuclear renaissance to serve the AI companies and their greed for massive data centers, and crossing the already blurry line between the nuclear power and nuclear weapons sector does nothing to serve the public interest. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, which I will do now so that I don't have to interrupt the presentations. So I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. But I would also encourage each speaker to reintroduce themselves by name at the start of each presentation in case there are latecomers who missed this introduction. I will just read the bios so you know who we're going to listen to today in order of appearance. Starting with Sharon Squassoni, who is a research professor at the George Washington University, co-founder of the Climate Security Initiative, and a former United States government official. She is an expert in nuclear energy and its proliferation risks, and in nuclear weapons, arms control, and non-proliferation. Edwin Lyman is the Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. He has been with UCS since 2003. He has a PhD in physics from Cornell, and he is co-author of the 2014 book, Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster, published by the New Press. M.B. Ramana, and I'm not reading this in the order of speaking, I apologize, but we changed the order a few times. M.B. Ramana is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security and professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. He is the author of Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change, published by Verso Books. Diane Curran is one of the country's leading environmental and nuclear safety advocates and has won significant safety and environmental protection measures before the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and federal courts on behalf of state and local governments, citizen groups, and individuals. Peter Bradford, who is joining us by Zoom today, is a former member of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission and former chair of the New York and Maine Utility Regulatory Commissions. He has taught courses on energy policy and nuclear power at the Yale School of the Environment and at Vermont Law School. Joe Romm is a physicist, author, and prominent climate change communicator who served in the U.S. Department of Energy during the Clinton administration. Currently, he is a senior research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And at the end of their presentations, we will hear also from Tim Judson, who's the Executive Director of Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and Paul Gunter, who's the Director of the Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear. And we'll also be taking questions from any of you until 1 o'clock when we have to close. And since I did read them in the wrong order, I apologize. You will have to reintroduce yourselves when you come up to speak. So we'll begin now with Sharon Squassoni.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to Beyond Nuclear and the Nuclear Information Resource Service for hosting this really important event. So, Sharon Squassoni, I'm a former State Department, U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and the Congressional Research Service staffer. Looked at these issues for a long time. I apologize. I'm going to need to duck out for another meeting a little bit after this. So the order is not because this topic is the most important, but I need to get on. I'm going to talk about the military elements of this, supposed nuclear renaissance. Next slide. Got it? There we go. So just very briefly, going to look at three things: what's behind the big push, for military nuclear power, what are the problems and the risks, and what's actually happening. There's been a lot of news recently. All right, so why nuclear energy for the military? The cover slide, the photograph on my cover slide was actually a very old reactor, the PM2, that was deployed to Greenland. The Army's done this a long time, and they decided a long time ago that it wasn't cost effective. It just wasn't a good idea. So here we are, back 50, 60, 70 years later. What's the reasoning? Well, it's called strategic. Nuclear energy is strategic. This is not unique to nuclear energy. You may have noticed that the Trump administration has brought a lot of issues under the national security tent. But what are the specific things they call out? Well, it's necessary for AI domination. It's necessary for energy independence. We need access to uninterruptible power supplies on military bases and for forward deployed forces. The U.S. also, this is great power competition, the U.S. needs to outcompete Russia and China in so many different places, including nuclear exports. And the assumption is that the U.S. is going to uphold non-proliferation standards better than Russia and China, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is not the case. So I just bring up this little quote from the National Interest article 2 months ago. It highlighted that the Pentagon was actually screwing up nuclear energy for the military. But it had this quote, which is that the nuclear industry is really excited by DoD as a customer because they have deep pockets, a high tolerance for technical risk, and a history of turning experimental technology into successful commercial products. So underneath this all, there is a trend towards taking these military reactors and trying to translate them into the commercial sector. So my question for you here is, does the U.S. public have deep pockets and a high tolerance for technical risk? The recent policies, you may be aware of or familiar with the executive orders from last year, and I know some of the other panelists are going to dive a little deeper into those. But Linda mentioned this blurring of not just public and private, but also military and civilian. So I think some of what's behind this is that, some kind of public subsidies are fast and easy to do. So what you see in the particular executive order that I'm going to talk about is using Department of Energy sites and Department of Defense sites to host new nuclear reactors, microreactors, transportable reactors, but also using material that came from defense programs. And the most recent thing is taking plutonium, surplus plutonium, and handing it to industry for fuel. And in some cases, some of these companies have no experience with it. So this is an interesting development. In terms of the military versus civilian line blurring, why is that so important? Because if it's not civilian, you don't need NRC regulation. Now, there are a couple exceptions to this, and I will talk about them. Okay, next slide. All right. So what is behind this? They're trying to create a playbook. They're trying to take things that are done in the military sector with the hope that it will translate into commercial nuclear power. So speed up development and also make it cheaper, right? But that holds an assumption that there's a seamless transition from a reactor that has been licensed by the DOE or the DOD, and that it will then have this seamless transition to NRC licensing, right? It also ignores the fundamental costs associated or that plague small modular reactors, right? It's not about demonstrating that they work. It's about modularity and mass production. And that is not what you're going to get from military deployments of reactors. So, for a lot of reasons, and I know my time is short, I'm not going to go into why all their national security rationales for nuclear energy don't make a whole lot of sense, but here's one big one. AI, if you want AI dominance, you need power now, right? It's in the newspaper on the front page every day. Nuclear power is not going to supply that, not in the next 5 years, maybe not even in the next 10 years. I'll talk about these other things a little later. All right, so in effect, a national security sort of nuclear energy basis doesn't actually improve your national security, it actually worsens risks. So just for example, if you're going to have reactors based on military bases, if you're going to deploy those overseas, those are some military operations risks that we have not dealt with. If you are going to have new fuels, and I know Ed and we'll probably talk a little bit more in depth about this, and processes, those can increase proliferation risks, not reduce them. And I'm not even talking about safety issues. We're just talking about security. Okay, so this particular executive order, you might not have paid attention, it's really specific, right? It's meant to speed the deployment of advanced nuclear reactors at DOE and DOD sites, and it even contains deadlines, right? So DOE is supposed to have an operating advanced reactor by November 2027, but it's also supposed to designate AI at Department of Energy sites and also just operating with, so they don't have to be on DOE sites, but operating with Department of Energy sites as defense critical missions. Why? Because that gets it a free pass from regulations that they would normally have to abide by. DOD has a goal of having an operating Army-regulated reactor at a domestic facility by November 2028. What else is in the executive order? DOE needs to designate these two types of fuel, high assay, low enriched uranium, and plutonium, which they've done to distribute to industry. And they're supposed to jumpstart a privately funded nuclear fuel recycling, reprocessing, and fuel fabrication technologies at DOE and DOD sites, not just to make fuel for the military reactors, but also for commercial power reactors and research reactors. So you could have private recycling on a government site that is not NRC regulated for commercial power fuel. And lastly, this executive order called for promoting nuclear exports, right, because we have to outcompete Russia and China, to the tune of 20 new nuclear cooperation agreements by the end of the 120th Congress. So that's in 2 years' time. That's the next Congress. You know how many nuclear cooperation agreements we have now? Take a guess. 23, so more or less, right? One of them is with a whole bunch of countries in Europe. So we're going to double those. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end just about the Saudi agreement. Next slide. All right. So what has DOE done so far? Well, it has designated sites for AI. They're up there. It has put together the HALEU and plutonium distribution programs. And look which companies are getting plutonium. Oklo doesn't even have, do they have a plutonium fueled reactor? No.
They have a plan.
They have a plan for one. Okay. Right. So the $19 million, which is not, sorry about the typo, which is not a lot of money, has been awarded to these companies on the bottom to solve the economic and technological challenges associated with fuel recycling. Those challenges are so significant that we gave up on fuel recycling in the 1970s, not just because of cost, but because of the proliferation implications. They have awarded $20 million to companies that have no experience. Next slide. All right, what's DOD done? You might be familiar with Project Pele. This has been going on since the first Trump administration. It's a microreactor hosted at the Idaho National Lab. That may come online by 2028, but notice it's already been 9 years for a military reactor on a government site. That might give you a little pause. The Advanced Nuclear Power Initiative, which was launched in 2024, for the most part, those reactors should be NRC licensed. I think the Air Force and also the Navy have said, we're going to go with NRC licensing. But what happened last year is that the Army created this project Janus, which is specifically not using NRC licensing, and they have identified 9 bases just last month or 2 months ago that could be candidate sites. And lastly, the Navy, which has a lot of experience in small modular reactors, right? I mean, it's built almost as many naval reactors as we have commercial nuclear power reactors in the US. They're getting in on this business as well. They just recently identified, to my mind, these are a lot of local bases, right? Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, but they're probably going to use commercial vendors and probably NRC licensing. But the best was just announced last week. They're going to take the USS Ford nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and they're going to feed electricity to the Norfolk base. I would like to ask you, do you think that's a good use of a $50 billion platform to provide backup? I think there are a lot of other options. Next slide.
Sure.
All right, so finally, my summary slide. Okay. Using Department of Energy and DoD sites to end run NRC licensing, if that is the objective, it won't speed commercialization of small modular reactors for the reasons I already gave. And it won't be, even that won't be quick enough to help AI dominance. Handing out HALEU and plutonium to industry, but more importantly, recycling, the US re-energizing or actually developing a commercial recycling program has specific proliferation risks, particularly if other countries follow our lead. Outcompeting Russia and China in nuclear exports. What we are poised to do is to allow South Korea and Saudi Arabia to do enrichment of uranium and reprocessing of plutonium. We're granting consent. I mean, the deals are not, the ink is not dry, but that will be a sea change in our non-proliferation policy. And then the last point I wanted to make is that ongoing wars, we've seen what's happened in Ukraine, at Zaporizhia, at Chernobyl, which has a hole in the containment above it, and also a drone attack on Baraka, the Baraka UAE nuclear power plant in the course of the Iran war, suggests that there are ample reasons that we might need to go slower with not just the nuclear power plants we sell overseas, but also specifically deploying some of these reactors with our forces overseas. Thank you very much.
I'm Peter Bradford, and I did serve a term on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nuclear power's safety challenge is that it creates very large quantities of energy. It also creates radioisotopes so dangerous that accidents releasing a significant part of them could kill and harm a lot of people and render a great many square miles of land uninhabitable for a long time. Containing those radioisotopes, as well as preventing the spread of nuclear bombs, is absolutely essential and unavoidably expensive. With nuclear power under relentless cost pressure as a result of the expanding success of clean energy sources lacking such challenges, nuclear cost cutting at the expense of safety is a serious prospect. A catastrophic event would be a disaster for the nation in which it occurred and for nuclear power itself. So the trade-off, stated theoretically, has always been zero tolerance for unacceptable radiological danger, secured by costly engineered safety systems and standards, as required by a conservative and rigorous regulatory presence, professing to issue nuclear safety mandates without regard to their costs. Each of the world's serious nuclear accidents and many of the near misses resulted in part from regulators like the post-World War II U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, prioritizing the economic interests of the nuclear industry to a level equal to or above safety regulation. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission was created in 1975 by a Congress determined to separate such promotion from safety. After shocking cost overruns and cancellation of partially built plants, new nuclear orders throughout the Western world at the end of the 20th century ceased. Mentions of a nuclear renaissance in the U.S. began soon thereafter with the release of the 2001 Bush-Cheney Energy Plan. Then as now, the renaissance rested on a tripod consisting of multi-billion-dollar subsidy, endless political support, and procedural streamlining of an ill-defined regulatory burden. All three of those supports were delivered, but new reactors, still too expensive, were not. Two reactors 15 years late and costing several times the original Renaissance estimates meant that not a single molecule of carbon was avoided by new U.S. reactors in the first 23 years of the Renaissance. All of the heavy lifting was done by cheaper, cleaner alternatives that were unforeseen in the 2001 plan. With new nuclear plants priced out of power procurement markets throughout the Western world, efforts to reduce costs focused first on improving the efficiency of nuclear power plant operations, and then on regulatory processes such as public participation. Direct reductions in the safety regimen itself were not considered a prudent way to cut costs. While substantial nuclear cost savings have occurred, other energy sources have improved even faster, so nuclear power has remained too expensive to succeed. Further savings are needed, some from reduced safety. Some are imaginary or at best unproven. Proponents of various new reactor designs claim that they are even safer than the existing fleet and will be successful in the marketplace if only the public can be made to pay up front for most of the commercialization costs. This conjecture is paired with the dangerous proposition that these unproven designs will be so much safer than their predecessors that many NRC standards and requirements can be scrapped for them before the first of the new reactors has proved itself by operating for a single minute. Accepting this assertion requires one to believe that the same designs that are so risky that government must conscript their capital are too predictable and safe to require the conservatisms of conventional regulation. Here the Trump administration has the imagination that its predecessors have lacked. With bipartisan congressional encouragement, the administration has bought into the nonsensical proposition that nuclear power's economic woes are somehow a product of a heavy-handed U.S. safety regimen, despite the fact that the safety regimen was the product of an industry-sensitive regulatory agency whose 20th century commissioners were entirely industry vetted and predominantly appointed by Republican presidents. To solve this non-existent problem, the Trump administration has recombined economic promotion with regulation. As he has done with other agencies whose mission is to protect the public through sound science, comprehensive oversight, and firm enforcement, President Trump has undertaken to hollow out the NRC. Ed Lyman will describe these measures in a moment. The President's 2025 executive orders also forbid the NRC from revisiting risks addressed in reactor approvals that they require from the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. So the designees of Pete Hegseth may soon be in charge of a slice of the safety culture governing the deployment of future reactors in U.S. communities. A larger slice will develop under Secretary of Energy Chris Wright, who was, until his DOE appointment, on the board of Oklo, one of the companies hoping to build these advanced reactors with taxpayer-financed assistance allocated by his Department of Energy. Given this executive branch domination, One must also note this administration's capacity for misusing regulatory power. The Federal Communications Commission, in particular, offers concrete examples of an NRC-like regulatory agency, now often criticized for bending its powers to political ends. The Trump Media and Technology Company has already announced a merger agreement with TAE Technology, a nuclear fusion company. While the fusion regulatory regimen will be separate from that of fission reactors and may not have much to regulate for many years, the regulatory system put in place by the Trump executive orders leaves few, if any, meaningful safeguards against self-serving favoritism on behalf of Trump friends and family. The Atomic Energy Commission was broken up in 1975 because allowing promotion to Trump regulation led to a series of episodes that were discrediting nuclear power and endangering the public. Japan went through something similar after the Fukushima accident. The US now seems on its way to being the first nation to have to learn this expensive structural set of lessons twice. Period.
And thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And I'm Edwin Lyman. I'm Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'd just like to start with a disclaimer that UCS, we've been around for more than 50 years, and from the very beginning of the organization, it focused on nuclear safety back when the Atomic Energy Commission was in charge, as Peter just described. UCS has always taken a neutral position on nuclear power. We don't promote it and we don't oppose it. But we do feel very strongly that if nuclear power is going to succeed, it has to have a strong and science-based regulatory framework to protect public health, safety, and security. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past few years is that the licensing process is becoming corrupted to the point that we no longer have confidence that the federal regulators of nuclear power are going to be able to ensure public health, safety, and security and protect the environment. And as a result, we are deeply concerned that this could pose undue risks to the American public. Next slide, please. So the changes to the NRC's regulatory framework really did start before the second Trump administration, but they are accelerating now as a result of the Executive Order 14300, which directed what was characterized as reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And this had many components to it. But one of them was setting essentially arbitrary mandatory timelines for licensing actions, including approval of new reactors. It directed the NRC to conduct a wholesale revision of all its regulations and guidance within 18 months, a Herculean task. But it didn't necessarily describe what the purpose of those revisions would be. It also called for essentially discarding the science-based regulatory framework based on of radiation protection in favor of essentially conspiracy theory-driven pseudoscience theories about ionizing radiation exposure and its potential benefits for human health, according to the conspiracy theories. And it also, as we heard, called for expediting NRC approvals of previously authorized reactors by DOD or DOE. Next slide, please. And complementary to that was the executive order regarding DOE test reactors. This is the order that initiated the Department of Energy's reactor pilot program, which, according to the directive, will have at least 3 test reactors authorized by the Department of Energy and going critical by next month, by July 4th. The it was revealed by NPR that the Department of Energy had rewritten its guidance for how it would conduct those authorizations, specifically to facilitate the authorization of these reactors, and pared down its guidance, stripped it to very general requirements, and essentially did everything possible to make it possible to start up reactors that were essentially on paper to be able to build and start them up within a year. And these reactors, although authorized under this DOE pathway, have the potential for expedited approval again under NRC rules, and how that is actually going to be done is still subject to debate. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of dozen rules that the NRC is rewriting under this wholesale revision of regulation. I just want to call your attention to a few of them. One of them is called Reforming and Modernizing, Reforming and Modernizing the NRC's Radiation Protection Framework. That's the directive to ignore the scientific consensus on the harms of low-level radiation. And again, we don't know where that's going because the proposed rule has been delayed several times and is now not scheduled to come out until July. But there are two other rules that are deeply concerning. One is called Modernizing Reactor Licensing, Safety Oversight, and Siting Practices. And there's virtually no public information about the content of that rule, what its focus is going to be, what it's going to do. But from its title, it has the potential to supersede essentially everything else. The entire NRC body of licensing and safety oversight, which is deeply troubling. And in particular, it could invalidate the new rules that the NRC has just issued over the last couple of years, including the congressionally directed, the Part 53 rule for reactor licensing, which was directed by NEMA, and the microreactor licensing rule, which is a 500-page rule, which was issued as a proposed rule just last month. But this new rule could potentially make those irrelevant. And there's a companion rule regarding modernizing security, which again should be deeply troubling to anyone who's concerned about the proliferation and nuclear terrorism risks that we heard about from Sharon. So as Peter pointed out, one of the main motivations for the idea that we can deregulate the licensing of new reactors is that their designs are inherently safe compared to the existing fleet, and therefore they don't need to meet the same standards that operating reactors do. But in fact, many of the claims about the safety and security of these reactors are misleading or outright false. In fact, many of these designs have the potential for being even less safe based on their fundamental characteristics. And as a result, these unproven designs need to have more scrutiny before they're deployed, not less, but that's unfortunately not the direction we're going in. And the risks of deploying these untested experimental new reactors are going to be compounded by some of the regulatory rollbacks that the NRC has already essentially finalized, including removing long-time prohibitions against siting reactors in densely populated areas, permitting reactors to be built without the physical containment structures that formerly distinguished why Chernobyl in 1986 was such a horrendous disaster compared to Fukushima, which was a slightly less horrendous disaster, but part of the reason was the containment. The rules allow for eliminating all off-site emergency planning, which is utter foolishness. It calls for reducing or even eliminating security officers to protect these plants from radiological sabotage, from terrorist attack, and trained operators or even on-site operators at all. And it would also open the door for using more dangerous fuels in reactors than the current low-enriched uranium that's used in light water reactors. These include the use of plutonium fuels that we heard about, and the use of high-assay low-enriched uranium, which poses greater security risks than lower-enriched grades of uranium. Next slide, please. So just to go through some of the myths, the idea that these advanced reactors are passively safe and will shut themselves down has already been disproven for most designs. In fact, many of them can't even achieve a stable state, or they can't achieve a zero power state when they're shut down in an accident, but they can only go to low power. And in some cases, for instance, the NuScale small modular reactor design, it was found out they could become unstable just due to the passive safety systems that operate and could potentially cause a severe accident, even being driven by the same passive safety forces that shut it down in the first place. Next slide, please. Another myth is the notion that sodium fast reactors like the Natrium being built by TerraPower in Kemmerer, Wyoming, is a passively safe reactor. In fact, historically, fast reactors are known to be unstable under power increases or coolant boiling. Again, the same safety problem that plagued Chernobyl. Next slide, please. And finally, TRISO fuel. This is the so-called wonder fuel that the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense and the NRC and many in the industry claim is the safest fuel on Earth. But in fact, the reality is TRISO fuel is not invulnerable. In fact, even I have a graph here of the X-Energy XE100, their construction permit application, which clearly shows that under certain analyzed accidents, the fuel temperature can exceed the limit which has been established as the safe limit for this fuel. Next slide, please. Okay, all right, I'm done. Thank you.
Howdy, thank you. I'm Joe Romm, former Acting Assistant Secretary of Energy Efficiency for Renewable Energy and Efficiency way back in the Clinton administration. The first job that I got here was actually, I was Special Assistant to Deputy Secretary Bill White in 1993, and he oversaw all the energy programs. He had me help oversee the nuclear program, and since 1993, I have been tracking the hype about nuclear and that it was somehow about to have a renaissance, and it was, you had it, yeah. That it was about to have a renaissance, and what has happened, no, go back, yeah. It was, supposedly, there's been a renaissance. If you Google nuclear renaissance, I think you will find that every few years there's been one. And thankfully, if the actual renaissance had been anything like the nuclear renaissance, we'd still be in the dark ages. But I guess in some respects we still are. So yeah, this whole thing is a great con job, and I would urge people to read this Capitol Hill citizen piece, big tech campaign to fast-track nuke energy. It is staggering. I didn't even fully understand. I mean, this is a massively long piece describing a purchasing of energy policy at a level that just boggles the mind, and with Bill Gates at the centerpiece, a man who does not know anything about energy, does not know anything about climate change, and is, I would have thought, rather discredited, but apparently not. One thing, there are two things you can say about nuclear power. If you build new nuclear plants, people's rates will go up. Okay, so if you're concerned about affordability, you definitely don't want to build nuclear power plants. The second thing we know is the United States has not built a nuclear power plant faster than 10 years duration of time in decades. So not going to help you with the AI crisis, and I expect the AI data center boom will bust before we actually complete a single nuclear plant. And I will say, I don't think we're going to complete a great many nuclear plants in this country. I think we are going to start a certain number, and it is going to be the same epic tragedy that occurred with Romm. That we're going to spend a lot of money, not going to finish it because the demand is going to collapse, and that's going to raise everyone's rates, and it's be the third time that's happened. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a new slide. I found this in the International Energy Agency. This is now my favorite new slide. So about that nuclear renaissance, this is actually just from May. This is a chart of annual change in global electricity generation by sources just the last 2 years. And you'll notice something about it. In 2024, lots of growth in solar and wind, some growth even in coal and natural gas, little growth in nuclear. 2025, not much growth in nuclear at all, continued explosion in solar and wind. Nuclear share of global power peaked in the 1990s at 17%. By 2022, it was down to 9.2%. In 2024, 9.1%. And just last year, it dropped to 8.9%. So there is no renaissance going on. It is a total fabrication. Right. This is the entire world. And by the way, the only country that's building any substantial amount of nuclear plants is China, which is great. They're not a market economy. It's a teeny fraction of their overall build in solar and wind. If you were to take China out, you would find a total collapse of nuclear power around the world. Let's go to the next slide. So what Trump has proposed, among a series of delusional executive orders that are comparable to his they're not much different between those and the things that he puts out on his Truth Social platform, in all honesty, because he seems to think we're going to have 300 net new gigawatts of reactors built by 2050. And it is safe to say that of all the things that he's ever said, this is the absolute least likely to ever happen. And that's obviously saying a great deal. You would require hundreds, if not thousands, of new reactors. There's only been 2 reactors built this century in this country. Successfully, I should say, right? Those are the 2 Vogtle plants. Those are AP1000s. Those are 1,100 megawatts each. They each took, 7+ years more than expected. So they were all like 12 to 15 years to build them. They were all massive overrun in cost. And the ultimate total price, probably around $38 billion. It's hard to actually quantify exactly because the numbers are not, it's relatively opaque. But one thing one can say is just those 2 reactors raised electricity rates in Georgia 25% and led to a massive, shocking rejection of 2 Republican public service commissioners. For the first time in decades, 2 Republicans were thrown out and 2 Democrats went in statewide elections in Georgia for a relatively obscure race. Just tells you how catastrophically bad people do not want their electricity prices going up. And the Georgia plant was the most expensive power plant ever built on Earth. It may be beaten in the next few years if the British ever finish one of their reactors. That will be maybe a $50 billion plant. But until then, and hopefully for a long time, this will be the most expensive plant ever built. South Carolina tried to build 2 of these AP1000s. They spent $9 billion, didn't finish them. Guess what? Electricity rates still went up because you're actually allowed to raise the electricity rates for ratepayers, even if you never finish building the plant. So this is a boondoggle in the making. Westinghouse went bankrupt, it should be noted, in 2017. Trump, however, has made a deal that if he can resuscitate Westinghouse, the federal government will get a very big chunk of their IPO. So we are in the unusual conflict of interest that the federal government's job is both to regulate the safety of the reactors that it itself will profit if it can get people to build them quickly enough to matter. I mean, it is unprecedented in the world. This is exactly why, as you heard, we eliminated the Atomic Energy Commission. Next one. Again, I don't have to repeat just how alarming the entire affordability issue has become. That affordability issue is strongly linked to electricity prices and natural gas heating. And if you were to actually pursue a nuclear renaissance, then what would happen is you would make data centers even less politically attractive than they are, and you would probably double the amount of opposition to them. Next slide. I know that people are very keen on these advanced reactors. The first thing to be said about them is that they don't exist. And so I apologize for talking about a hypothetical, fanciful science fiction experiment that no country in the world has ever successfully completed. That is to say, the commercialization of a small modular reactor. These reactors aren't actually small. You get to be called a small reactor if you're 300 megawatts. That is larger than most natural gas plants in this country. Okay? They're not modular. By the way, the Westinghouse AP1000s were sold as being modular, just for the record. Why do they call them small and modular? Because that is PR, that is advertising. Why? They're only the two qualities that allow you to say you're going to come down a cost curve are being small and modular, but that's solar cells and battery cells, right? That's small, that's modular, not a multi-100 megawatt reactor. So anyway, the Georgia plants hit a cost of $18 million per megawatt. That was the cost of the Vogtle units. This was just the cost projections of various small modular reactors. The NuScale plant was shuttered just when the cost projection didn't start construction. Just the cost projection exceeded the Vogtle plants. Bill Gates said on CBS News 2 years ago, this month actually, I believe, that the first Natrium reactor would cost $10 billion, which would make it almost $30 million per megawatt. For the record, Columbia University did an analysis which said that if you went above 6,000 per megawatt, 6 million per megawatt for a new reactor, you couldn't possibly compete. I just want to make a comment on this whole modularity nonsense. So there are 51 small modular reactor designs globally involved in licensing, 27 in the US. The US is pursuing 27 small modular reactors. The entire value proposition for small modular reactors is that they're going to be mass produced. That assumes there's one winner, maybe two. So it's going to be, 15, 20 years before these guys duke it out. And maybe sometime in the 2040s, they'll have found one that is maybe more affordable. Probably not, though. Next. I'll put this as the last slide. So this is a chart that Wood Mackenzie did that was in the Financial Times in October. So the most expensive form of power in the year 2030, this is a projection. This is for projects completed in 2030. Most expensive, small reactors. Next most expensive, conventional nuclear, but guess what gas is now expensive? Thanks to the data center boom, the price of new combined cycle turbines have tripled, and the price of natural gas went up 50% between 2024 and 2025. The future is wind and solar and batteries. That has been 93% of new capacity generation in this country in 2024, 2025, and despite Trump's best efforts, 2026. So any effort to build any substantial number of nuclear power plants is certainly going to fail, but I suspect and I fear we're going to start building a whole bunch of them, and the ratepayers will be stuck with them, and maybe some of them will turn on briefly. The Romm reactor turned on at low power for a couple hours, and then was shuttered because it didn't even make sense to run the Romm reactor after it was complete. That's how uneconomic nuclear reactors are. Thank you.
I'm Diane Curran. For 45 years, I have represented environmental groups in state and local governments in NRC licensing and enforcement proceedings, as well as in federal court appeals. I'm going to talk about climate change. I currently represent Beyond Nuclear and the Sierra Club in a case challenging the NRC's refusal to consider how climate change may affect the safety and environmental integrity of nuclear reactors, both in initial licensing and in license renewal proceedings, of which there are two kinds: initial license renewal after the 40-year term, and then a second license renewal term, which a number of plants are now going through. Our case has been briefed and argued in the DC Circuit, and we are awaiting a decision. Climate change must be accounted for in reactor licensing because it challenges the NRC's ability to ensure safe operation over the decades of a license term. Weather-related hazards, including floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, derechos, wildfires, and drought, are becoming more severe and more frequent. Assessing how those risks are likely to evolve over the life of a reactor is difficult, but it is essential to protecting public safety and environmental integrity. It is also essential to ensure reliability of the energy supply if you're planning to rely on nuclear. Unfortunately, even before the Trump administration took office, the NRC has consistently declined to take a systematic approach to how climate change could affect the future safety of new and existing reactors. Instead, the agency has generally looked backwards, relying on the worst weather events in history in order to design a reactor for the future. So in other words, the worst flood, the worst hurricane, we'll design against that. The worst thing that happened, looking in the rearview mirror, but nothing about the future. With respect to the changing risks of the future, the NRC simply says that its safety oversight includes large margins and defense in depth. So we got it covered, trust us, don't worry, things are very safe. We need look no farther than Hurricane Helene to see how quickly the lessons of the past and generalizations about safety margins can evaporate in the face of the very unique and severe challenges posed by extreme weather events. No hurricane with such record-breaking rainfall had passed through the Appalachian Mountains before. Flooding and landslides resulted in 250 deaths and between $80 and $250 billion in damages. Consider how much worse the effects of Hurricane Helene might have been had it passed about 25 miles to the west over the 3-reactor Oconee nuclear plant in the mountains of South Carolina. Oconee was built in the 1970s into the side of an earthen dam. It's a pump storage plant. It's beneath 2 lakes totaling about 2 million acre-feet of water. It was built at a time before dam failure was considered to be a credible event. What if the effects of Hurricane Helene had included dam failure and a radiological accident? The devastation to human health and the environment and the economy would be almost unimaginable. But the NRC recently relicensed Oconee to operate for a second license renewal term, refusing demands to consider climate change in its decision. If the Atomic Energy Act were the NRC's only governing statute, the public would have limited recourse to challenge the NRC's refusal to consider climate change. Because the NRC is the principal agency carrying out the Atomic Energy Act, the courts generally give it broad discretion in how it does so. But the NRC is also governed by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Although NEPA and its implementing regulations have been narrowed in recent years by Congress and the NRC, its core requirement remains the same. When a potential environmental impact could significantly affect the human environment, the NRC must identify and evaluate that impact and consider alternatives to mitigate it. NEPA is called an action-forcing statute precisely because if an agency won't look at a problem under its organic statute, NEPA says, you got to look anyway. We're not going to make you do anything in particular, but you've got to talk about it. We are hopeful that the case now pending in the D.C. Circuit will compel NRC to address the safety and environmental implications of climate change in reactor licensing and license renewal proceedings. Given the Trump administration's public position on climate change, and given its desire to cut costs for the industry, we shouldn't hold our breath that the NRC will produce a strong environmental analysis in the near term. Even so, a court victory would still be significant in three important respects. First, it would establish that climate change is real and must be addressed in reactor licensing. Members of the public could take this to their legislators. It could take it to investors and potential investors in nuclear power and say, look, this is real, not being dealt with adequately. Money's important, money talks, right? If they don't get the money for these things, they won't be built. A favorable ruling would also push future NRC leadership to incorporate climate change into licensing decisions. Hopefully there will be a different administration sometime. And finally, even if the NRC's analysis of climate-related accident risks were weak or flawed, state and local governments would be able to make their own evaluation of the NRC's work, make their own decisions about whether they're going to allow these things to go forward under state law. These are discouraging times for nuclear reactor regulation, but with respect to climate change, Mother Nature will have the final word, not the Trump administration. Despite attempts to weaken it, NEPA remains a meaningful tool for forcing the NRC to reckon with this reality before great harm is done. Thank you.
My name is Ramana. I teach in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And it's always hard coming after a series of speakers because they tell you everything that you want to speak about. So I'm just going to sort of reinforce some things that they mentioned and elaborate a little bit on that. And I'll sort of broadly make 3 points. So the first I want to say is, if somebody from the nuclear industry were here, they would say, these people are all talking about these old kinds of reactors. Now we have this new generation of reactors. They're not going to have any of these problems. They're going to be perfect, et cetera, et cetera. And they use all these, terms like, advanced nuclear reactors and small modular reactors and so on. And, if you look at the, details of these designs, there's not a lot that's actually new about these. I mean, most of these reactor designs go back to the 1940s and 50s and the sort of, when there was expectation that nuclear energy was going to grow so fast and most of our electricity should have been now from nuclear reactors had you gone back to the 1950s. And so during that period, there were a very large number of nuclear reactor designs that were explored. I mean, Sharon sort of mentioned the Army's own nuclear power projects, which sort of explored a bunch of designs, but there were a whole bunch of others as well. And some of these were built at that time, and others were not even built. And those that were built, they found lots of problems with it. In particular, the 4 main kinds of designs that we talk about in case of small modular reactors and so-called advanced reactors are either the light water reactors, which are the common ones, or water-cooled reactors in general. I come from Canada, where we use heavy water, not light water. Anyway, so there are water-cooled reactors. There are fast neutron reactors that Ed spoke about, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors that also Ed mentioned, and there are the so-called molten salt reactors. Right? And this is sort of, broadly speaking, the 4 categories. I mean, there are some variations of that. And all of these had been tried. And there's a reason why we have a lot of light water reactors and none of these other reactors, because they all had problems with them. And I can sort of talk about what these problems were. But in most of these cases, the issue was that the utilities realized that it wouldn't make sense to operate them and make money off it. So for example, the last high-temperature gas-cooled reactor that was built in the United States was in Fort St. Vrain in Colorado. And it basically ran for about 7 years, if I remember right. I don't remember the exact number of years, but it was in the 1970s and 80s. And the utility decided to shut it down when they had some kind of a problem. It had operated with a load factor of around 15%, roughly speaking. And when the utility decided to shut it down, the New York Times actually carried a headline which said, the world's safest reactor is closing because it rarely runs. And that was very, very typical of that kind of reactors. And that's why many of these designs are not there. But what we are seeing with all these so-called small modular reactors, advanced reactors, is, if there's a nuclear engineering professor and they have like a few $100,000 in grant money, they can hire a few graduate students and they will go off and do some research into one of these old designs and then modify it a little bit, use a new alloy for this, use a slightly different design for the steam generator, and lo and behold, you have a new reactor design. So one of the designs that was mentioned here, Oklo, the company Oklo, the people who founded Oklo were graduate students in MIT when they started this whole design. And there was another student at the same time at MIT, Leslie Dewan, who had an idea for another reactor design that was supposed to be the greatest whatever thing, till one of the professors actually looked into the details and said, it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to be saying. So all that is to basically say there's a lot of hype here, and if you look behind, it's not really valid. And sort of digging a little bit deeper, the second point I want to make is that if you look at what a nuclear reactor designer would like to do, they're in designing a new reactor, they have some goals or some priorities, if you like. Typically, they talk about four main priorities. So one is the fact that you don't want to have severe accidents. You want to lower the risk of accidents. And so you want to make your reactor design safer. A second goal might be that you want to make it cheaper. Joe talked about the costs of these reactors. And so you would like to make your nuclear reactor cheaper in a way. A third is, Sharon Squassoni talked about the risk of proliferation, and different designs have different kinds of pathways to proliferation, increase the risk or lower the risk depending on the kind of design choices that are made. So that's another priority. And the last, which I don't think anybody mentioned so far, is the challenge of dealing with radioactive wastes. We still don't have a demonstrated way of safely dealing with this. And the best that the nuclear industry has come up with is to essentially dig a deep hole somewhere, bury it, and hope and pray that it never comes out. They won't call it that way. They will say, oh, we have a geological repository and there are engineered barriers and so on. But in plain language, that's what it means. And so all of these are priorities. So some nuclear designs, for example, pride themselves on the fact that they produce less radioactive waste, right? So that's also another kind of priority. Many years ago, my former colleague Zia Mian and I looked at a whole bunch of small modular reactor designs, and we observed something which is kind of obvious in hindsight, which is that no single design can actually optimize for all these different priorities. And if you try to make a design that does one of these priorities better, it'll do bad in the other priority. So to give an example, if you wanted to design a nuclear reactor that produces less radioactive waste, then you have to operate the reactor in what's called the fast spectrum, meaning that you don't slow down the neutrons that are emitted by the fission process, and these fast neutrons then go on to triggering other fission reactions, and which means that you have to have the reactor be much more concentrated in space. It has to have a lot more fissile material, enriched uranium or plutonium, packed together inside the core of the reactor with no moderator inside that. So it's a very concentrated source of heat, which means that then one thing you have to do is you cannot use water to cool it. That's why they use molten sodium or other kinds of metals. But the other thing that it means is that you have to have a lot more fissile material, a lot more plutonium or enriched uranium inside the core of the reactor. Therefore, this becomes more proliferation prone, because a country that imports this reactor, if they, without operating the reactor, just siphon off some of this plutonium or enriched uranium, they can process it and then hopefully produce a weapon with that. So there is always going to be this kind of trade-off between these different things. In particular, when you go to small reactors, small meaning less than 300 megawatts, then you lose out on what are called economies of scale, which is that if you want to build a reactor that produces 5 times as much electricity, you don't need 5 times as much concrete or 5 times as many workers, and therefore the cost per unit of power capacity or electrical energy generated becomes higher for a small modular reactor. And this is amply shown in the experiences we've had so far. The last thing I want to mention is the discussion about AI, and I think it was Joe who rightly mentioned that the timescales that we are talking about just don't meet the timescales at which these AI before the AI bubble bursts that they're going to need. But the other thing I want to mention is, if you want to understand how something works and why something is working, you also need to follow the money, right? This is the standard sort of advice given to any journalist, if you like. And so if you look at what's happening here in the AI, all these big tech companies making all these announcements, there are sort of 3 kinds. They all talk about, we are investing in nuclear power, that's why don't worry about emissions and so on and so forth. But if you dig deeper, you find there are sort of 3 kinds of nuclear projects they talk about. The first is, I'm done. The first is there are some where they are trying to revive an old nuclear reactor like 3 Mile Island or Palisades. And there are obvious safety risks there. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's one kind of process. The second is that they get into a contract with some operating nuclear plants with some utility company, and they basically siphon away electricity that formerly were supplied to consumers. So that's another way they can get some nuclear power. And the third, of course, is they make announcements about all kinds of small modular reactors and advanced reactors and so on. And if you read those press releases, most of the time they don't tell you anything about how much they're going to spend. But when they do say, what you see is that they often are spending. They're committing a few hundreds of millions of dollars. The highest number I've seen is from a consortium that involves NVIDIA and a bunch of other investors, saying they're going to invest $650 million. And of course, we don't read the fine print in the contracts. I'm sure they have smart lawyers who have all kinds of conditions before which they're going to spend this money. But compare that $650 million or $500 million from an Amazon consortium with the cost of even the cheapest small modular reactor design that we have talked about so far, which is the NuScale design, the UAMPS project in Idaho. The final cost estimate was $9.3 billion for just 460 megawatts. Okay, neither does the 460 megawatts match up with the energy demands of these data centers, nor does the cost match up with the few hundreds of millions of dollars. So the way I'd like to interpret it is these companies are spending this, are talking about this money and using not their energy budget, but their PR budget. And why are they doing this? Because I think one of the things they must have seen a few years ago was a lot of talk about cryptocurrency companies and Bitcoin and the amount of emissions from that. And it was a lot of bad press for the cryptocurrency industry, to the point that government started regulating it. Even the Biden administration had regulations on it. China actually banned Bitcoin mining. And so this, for my opinion, this is what they're thinking about. Oh, we should get ahead of this whole negative publicity by saying, don't worry about emissions. We are investing in small modular reactors. But it's not going to amount to anything there. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I am Pavan Acharya with the Energy team. I guess my question is for anyone who wishes to answer it. There's been a lot of focus on actions taken by the NRC during the second Trump administration and the impacts on safety in the long term in the nuclear space. Were there any actions taken under the NRC during the Biden administration that kind of also stood out in terms of potentially jeopardizing safety or are concerned to you guys.
Go ahead. So, Paul, if you introduce yourself, so we will have.
My name is Paul Gunter. I'm with Beyond Nuclear. I think one of the outstanding issues here is that the Biden administration signed the extension of the Price-Anderson Act. So that was going to sunset on December 31st, 2025. But Congress voted to extend the Price-Anderson Act, which provides limited liability to all these promises that the industry is making, which actually turns out to be a vote of no confidence when the industry is given the cover of the federal taxpayer in the event of a severe nuclear accident. And nothing that is being presented in this streamlining and this categorical exclusion offers enough Congress to put the industry's money at jeopardy. That was the Biden administration's vote.
Anybody else want to answer? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, more generally, that was the Advance Act that got very strong bipartisan support in Congress for. Biden signed into law, but that did start the ball rolling, in that it was a push by Congress to essentially pressure the NRC into speeding up its licensing, removing certain roadblocks, but the act and changing its mission statement, which, although the final act watered down what was originally proposed, it still pressured the NRC into moving away from its focus solely on protecting public health and safety to taking into account what was essentially economic considerations of the industry. So that set things in motion, but things have become immeasurably worse now under Trump.
And I would add that the Biden administration gave $1 billion grants for resuscitating 3 aging nuclear plants that were scheduled to close and one had even been taken apart. Diablo Canyon in California, which was scheduled to close in 2024. The state's now extended that license in part in reliance on a grant. Palisades in Michigan that was being decommissioned, and a dangerous plant with an embrittled pressure vessel. And then 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, all Democratic governors that, why was this huge amount of money given to them to revive these plants that state regulators have decided it was time to close?
And I would add that, the Biden administration set up a very large pool of money in the DOE loan office. And, Jigar Shah was running it, and they were very, very careful about who they lent money to. But now it's usable for anything, and so what you're going to see is the Department of Energy, which say all of us are, guaranteeing the loan for these reactors. At the same time, the NRC is, being gutted, so the chance of something going wrong is larger, and because of the Price-Anderson Act, that's also on the public if there is a disaster. And of course, they will have cost overruns because that's what reactors do. So we'll be on the hook. Taxpayers and ratepayers will be on the hook for every single thing that goes wrong in the next 15 years. And that's not capitalism. Right? That's pretty much the exact why the Cato Institute, opposes nuclear power. It is the exact opposite of capitalism. It is the government buying and subsidizing and putting the entire risk on the public.
Thanks.
And
Okay.
I think to underscore that last point that Joe made, if you look at who's proposing to build reactors now, it's not the traditional utility companies, which had ready access to charging ratepayers for the cost of these projects. You see the consequence of that with the Vogtle reactors, but that's what went on in the entire first generation of nuclear construction in the U.S. With the exception of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is planning to build one small modular reactor, all of the other reactors that are currently being proposed in the U.S. would be built by companies that aren't utility companies, that aren't even merchant generation companies. These are startup companies, most of them, that have never built or operated a reactor before and have no access to a ready rate base to be able to recoup their costs. And so when those risks on these loan guarantees come through, and then the U.S. taxpayers' investments come through, that's all on the public.
And the Tennessee Valley Authority is basically a government. I mean, when I was at the Department of Energy, right? I mean, basically you're picking the board, and so it will do what the government says.
Great, thank you. So,
Thank you.
the gentleman behind you, and then Russell, yeah?
Hi, I'm Jordan from Congresswoman Schakowsky's office. As nuclear waste management was briefly mentioned, we were wondering if there has been any rule changes or deregulations within the NRC to nuclear waste management or anything around that?
I mean, a number of the things that, the changes that are occurring or will happen could impact nuclear waste management. For example, the dose standards that are established for primarily, not for necessarily high-level waste management, but spent fuel for other waste streams. Those could all change if they change the radiation protection standards that are in place to limit effluents, protect the public. So that's one example. But overall, as far as waste management writ large, disposal of spent fuel, there's not much the NRC can do because it's really the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is still the governing law. But it can, the NRC certainly can make changes which could make storage of spent fuel less safe. For example, one thing they have done already is not increase the requirements for protecting spent fuel storage against terrorist attacks. And this dates back well beyond to the first Trump administration. They decided not to do that.
Yeah, and I think there's also every other category of radioactive waste, what we usually call low-level radioactive waste, are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission directly. And the reason why we felt it was important to have this briefing now is that because the NRC is rolling out this wholesale revision of its regulations through these various rule changes that are coming down in the next few months. And so there are some that are forthcoming right now that could effectively deregulate the disposals of low-level radioactive waste, both because of the dose standards that Ed mentioned, but also because of the standards that can be applied to the licensing and the regulation of radioactive waste sites themselves.
And, I think on the panel, we take it for granted that everyone understands that there's never been a high-level radioactive waste facility, that's been permitted and cited in this country. It was going to be Yucca Mountain. I was at the DOE when those discussions were held. No one wants this waste, so it's being held in, the spent fuel is being held where you build the reactors, right? And there's now a lot of evidence that low-level radiation does, in fact, cause is strongly linked to cancer. Now it's linked to Parkinson's and other issues. So it's just crazy, right? That if you imagine a home had to have its cesspool just was floating around the house, nobody would put up with it for a second.
I just want to add that under the current situation of streamlining licensing, we're seeing a situation being set up right now in Parsons, Kansas, where a utility, upstart, new start, as I would call it, who's only been around for 3 years, is under this DOE reactor pilot project process, which has been handed the option of categorical exclusion from environmental review, otherwise required under the National Environmental Policy Act. However, Deep Fission, as it's announced itself, its intent is to build nuclear power stations, small modular, these are very small, 15 megawatt electric, but to put it down a 1 mile, 30-inch wide shaft, and then operate these reactors they're not going to be refueled. They're going to be basically run a 2 to 7 year fuel cycle and then shut down, and then they're going to start stacking them in these mile deep shafts. But again, they're talking about both generating nuclear waste and then in a subsequent deep geological repository without doing an environmental review on either the technology or the disposal method. I mean, this is really fast track, and this is not in the public or environmental interest.
Hi, Tim Gardner at Reuters, thanks. Maybe for Joe and Ed and others, now that you've had a few days to absorb the announcement about the 5 companies getting plutonium, could you talk about your concerns about that? And also this argument that the fuel is mixed with actinide, so it can never be made into a bomb efficiently.
Go ahead. Yep.
Guess I can start. So I worked also with Diane for decades to
Let's try a different one.
prevent the first, the original plan to convert the original to the stockpile of surplus plutonium to fuel that was supposed to be for light water reactors. And the concept has never made sense from either an economic or a safety or security perspective, and it certainly doesn't now. The original NOx project, as you probably know, was going to cost more than $50 million and was canceled in favor of a much cheaper alternative, which would have been to dilute and dispose the material and bury it underground instead of the cost of processing it, trying to turn it into safe and usable fuel, and providing the protection that plutonium needs. Now all that cheaper and safer alternative has been abandoned in lieu of this half-baked idea that this 20 metric tons of plutonium can be quickly converted into fuel as a bridge fuel while the industry waits for high-assay uranium facilities to be built. But the idea that plutonium could actually be used more quickly than uranium fuel is absurd because of the complexity, the attention to safety and security that a plutonium fuel facility would actually require. All those factors make it a much less usable material than uranium. So the claims, for instance, from Oklo that this is going to be a bridge fuel, that they can just quickly convert this plutonium into usable fuel is just not fact-based. In fact, most of that material is very impure. And one of the reasons why the original NOx program was so expensive was because the factory needed to have a large chemical processing plant to try to convert all these different impure forms of plutonium into something that would be pure enough to be used as reactor fuel, and that problem hasn't gone away.
Yeah, I would just add, this idea of recycling is just another one of those PR things. Like we think of recycling as, oh, that's good for the environment, right? We're taking something useless and turning it into something useful, and all you're doing here is taking something that's dangerous and expensively spending a lot of money, and you still end up with a vast amounts of radioactive waste. And I think that was actually another point about the small modular reactors that people have said they're going to have less waste. In fact, they may have more waste, but equally problematic, it'll be a different kind of waste for many of these technologies, and so you would have to isolate them and treat them differently than the waste that we're used to dealing with. But again, any small modular reactor company, since it's going to lose the benefits of economies of scale and therefore be more expensive generator of electricity than the large reactors, which are already unaffordable, you have to assume that they could be built at scale, right? So someone isn't I'm thinking of just building 1 or 2 of these, right? You would have to build dozens and dozens of these to even justify the whole value proposition. And again, we're all talking about a make-believe thing, right? Because we're talking about a commercial product, right, which doesn't exist, and no one knows when you could even finish building the first commercial product. All the ones that are being built now should just be considered experimental reactors, right? The chances of them of people getting the design right the first time and having it be within a factor of 2 of the price of electricity from other sources that continue to drop in price, is pretty infinitesimally small.
Also from corporate crime reporter and Capital Citizen, if Congress had renewed or reauthorized Price Anderson last year, what would be the outlook for the industry? Were there any members of Congress who stood up and said no to the reauthorization of Price Anderson? And who are the critics of that in Congress?
So the extension that was done in 2024 was done in the Advance Act. It was this sort of omnibus nuclear bill that was sort of packaged with a 4-page firefighter funding bill. So there was no debate that happened around the passing of the legislation when it went through. But the extension that was granted in that was only for new reactors that are going to be built going forward. Because in 2005, when Congress last extended the Price-Anderson Act, they grandfathered in every reactor that was built before 2024. And so the practical effect of it was to cover these new reactors there's so many of which are claimed to be passively safe and accident-proof. And so, but the industry was still insisting that extension had to be granted in order for the industry for this nuclear renaissance, quote unquote, to proceed.
Did any member of Congress speak out against it?
There were 2 votes against it in the Senate, Markey and Sanders, and there were.
That was for the Advance Act.
I think it was.
But there were no public hearings on the Price-Anderson Act. None.
I think it was Rashida Tlaib, actually, in the House, wasn't it, who voted either present or against, but she called it a poison pill, that because it was about firefighter compensation and they had shoehorned this nuclear piece into it, she referred to that, I'm not voting for a poison pill. But I can't remember if it was a present vote or a no vote. Present, thank you. Yeah.
Doggett voted against it.
Let me just add that, we're entering a very dangerous territory of maximum moral hazard, right? Because the question is, who cares about whether these reactors don't actually work and actually go awry, right? That is the central question. Obviously, the Price-Anderson Act guarantees that the people who build the reactor are not liable if things go wrong, right? A DOE loan indemnifies all of the investors, so they don't care if anything goes wrong. The only organization, the only body that actually oversees and in theory cares about whether something goes wrong is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So if you gut that, which is in the process of happening, right, there literally is nobody in the entire world that cares and can enforce an ability to ensure that people don't skimp. Right? Why wouldn't you skimp, right? You're trying to make this small reactor cheaper, so let's get rid of the containment vessel, right? Because if it does melt down, it'll be a small thing. You won't need to worry about wide dissemination. And you don't need to have backup systems again, right? That's a good way to save money. So all of these designs tend to have cost cutting built into them in order to be marginally close to being affordable. No oversight? Yes, you are entering the same territory that the Japanese did and the Russians did with their lack of oversight and their flawed management of nuclear reactors. The one thing you say about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is we haven't had a major reactor since 3 Mile Island, but that's not evidence that we don't need it. That's evidence that it was actually doing something quite useful.